So this is the PSOJ Roadmap to Jamaica 2.0 series. This is an ongoing series, and I'm so thrilled that you chose me to be your moderator. I'm Jackie Stewart Leckler. Thank you, PSOJ. And of course, we have some stellar presenters today, Laura and Gavin, who I'll speak about shortly. But just to let you know, this is an initiative from the PSOJ where we want to boost private sector investment. We want economic growth. Our buzzword is productivity. And we're just trying to figure out how can we help on this journey. And that's why we're here today. So JMMB is a proud sponsor. So is the Inter-American Development Bank. Thank you, JMMB and IDB, for sponsoring us and helping us on this desire to grow. In previous PSOJ conversations, the PSOJ has looked at the travel industry, tourism, trying to figure out how do we get them back on board, how do we employ the digital technology, because we've got to close that digital divide. Today, it's about Ireland's competitiveness, Jamaica's competitiveness. It plays a crucial role in labor transformation. And for us to be sustainable, we need to sort of step up our game a bit. We want to have some perspectives on our labor laws. How do we compare to the region? How do we challenge ourselves to be the best? We also want to hear about, current providers, about the technology. How could we make things better? We want to have some discourse around the elements of a roadmap to having digital connectivity. This is a must. If I leave you with one thought today, employees spend the majority of their waking life at work. So we want to make sure they're happy and engaged, because that's how we'll get this economic growth and productivity that we're looking for. This is how we can upgrade our skills. There's got to be that willingness. And so if that can be a takeaway, and if we can make something happen with what we already have, this will be a win-win. So today, please let me join Laura Rapani, Principal Specialist of the Labor Markets and Social Security Division of the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB, and our very own Gavin Goff, Attorney at Law, Partner at Myers, Fletcher and Gordon. And before I open the floor, I'll just say to you what we plan to do. Allow both presenters to give us a short little presentation. We'll talk for about an hour. And then hopefully after that, we can go into some question and answers and leave here with a framework and a roadmap to go forward. So I think I'd like to turn it over to Laura to do her presentation now. Laura, welcome.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, PSOJ, for the invitation to this event. I think it's perfect time to talk about competitiveness and how we can change regulations, skills, and productivity in Jamaica and in the region. I will share my screen to show the presentation for a second. Here, share, and we'll put this. Okay, let me see here. I will start the presentation from the beginning. Okay, great. So as I mentioned before, I would like to talk about labor costs, productivity, and skills. So a little bit of the agenda for the short presentation: the labor flexibility and labor costs in the region and in Jamaica, the need for increasing labor productivity, and reskilling and upskilling as a central part of the agenda for the future. So in terms of labor flexibility, one question that we can ask ourselves is, why do we need greater flexibility in our labor markets? And there are two good reasons why. There are technological and demographic changes that we have to pay attention to. The labor market is becoming more dynamic and more diverse, and we have increasing worker mobility, new forms of employment, new business models, creation of new jobs, demands for new skills, So overall, in the world, in the region, and in Jamaica in particular, we need greater flexibility in employment relations to enable market players to adapt to change more efficiently. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we see that we have high labor costs that are composed by different components. I'm not going to talk about these different components. And especially these costs are high if we compare them to the labor productivity levels. And this in general reduces incentives for firms to hire formal workers and also for the region to attract foreign investment. And I'm going to be talking about one indicator that is the minimum cost of salaried labor. So here we can see this vertical bar, and this is a general representation of the indicator where we see the minimum cost of salaried labor as a percentage of the GDP per worker. So this is the cost, basically the non-wage cost of hiring a formal worker, with the nominal restriction that legal wages cannot be lower than the minimum wage. So it's basically part of it is the minimum wage. Then we have paid leave, mandatory social security contributions, severance payment, firing notice, and bonuses. So in some sense, this is the annual dollar value of paying a worker the minimum wage plus all mandated non-wage costs as a share of the GDP per worker. So this vertical bar is a generalization of the indicator, but we're going to see the numbers for 20 countries in the region for which we have calculated this indicator. So here you see at the very left, Honduras, or the highest levels of the indicators is Honduras, Paraguay, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Bolivia, countries for which this indicator says that the costs of hiring a formal worker as a percentage of the GDP per worker is around 80%, 60%. It's very, very high. As we can see, the average for the region is around 39%. And the average for the OECD countries is a little bit more than 20% of the GDP per worker. Where is Jamaica? Jamaica is in the middle of the countries. As you can see, I put the Jamaica in orange, so you can see it clearly. It's near countries like Panama and Colombia, but it's over the levels of the OECD countries. So this is not ideal. It's not really bad, as in other countries, as I mentioned before, that have very high non-wage costs compared to the levels of productivity. But it's not in the situation, for example, of Mexico or Trinidad and Tobago or the Dominican Republic or Chile, for example. It has a higher labor costs compared to the levels of productivity of the country. So this is a very important graph to pay attention to. And we have to extract some key messages, right, from this graph. For the region, the cost of social insurance plus the implicit cost of labor laws and regulations make formal labor expensive relative to productivity. And this in the region reduces incentives for firms to hire formal workers. So as I mentioned before, for the region, it's 36% of GDP per worker in average, vis-a-vis 22% in OECD. And Jamaica is in the middle of the graph, as I mentioned before, with the cost of salaried labor of 25% of GDP per worker, higher than the average for OECD. Some caveats that we have to discuss, and we can, it's only to make a point of what the indicator is. One is that this representation is the de jure cost of salaried labor. So it's what's actually in the labor legislation. It's not, sometimes a law is there, but it's not applied to all firms, to everybody. So this is the de jure cost. And some of the costs are incurred in exchange of benefits. They might thought as deferred wages or savings, right? For example, pension contributions. So you're gonna get some retribution from what you are paying. Hence, it doesn't necessarily translate into taxes. And another caveat is that in some cases, employers might be able to translate part of these costs to employees. So we cannot think of the indicators as it all goes to the employer's side, but it can also translate into costs for the employees. So one reflection that we can do with the indicator is think how we can change it, right? How we can move to the right of the graph or the lower part of the graph and be more similar to countries like Dominican Republic or Chile or others. Well, it's mathematics, pure mathematics. You can change the numerator or change the denominator, right? You can decrease the numerator or increase the denominator. So changing the numerator of the indicator is basically decreasing labor costs. And it is important to review current legislation, and now Gavin can give us a look at the situation in Jamaica and see if there are spaces for changes in regulations, not only looking for rigidity of regulations, but also looking at spaces for more flexible set of rules, including telework, remote work, part-time work, other arrangements, because the post-COVID world, we know that these changes are happening and are more necessary for the functioning of the firms. And we can also think about changing the denominator, right? Increasing productivity. Here's this general graph for the region. You can see the green line being Latin America and the Caribbean, I should say. And you can see there that we are stagnated in the last 3 decades in terms of productivity in the region. And you can see regions like Asia or Central and Eastern Europe going up, but Latin America and the Caribbean staying stagnated and low. And you can see also, on this graph you might have seen in the past, how Jamaica is positioned in terms of productivity as a share of the US. And you see countries like Finland being 77% of US productivity, Israel 66%. I'm looking at countries outside the region first, but then you see Chile or Trinidad and Tobago at 46 or 42%. And then Jamaica is only at 16%, similar to countries like Guatemala or Bolivia. So this is a huge agenda for Jamaica, increasing productivity to be more competitive. And here we see also another measure taken with one of the survey in 2017. When we compare also Jamaica with other countries in the Caribbean, we also see that Jamaica is lower than other Caribbean countries like Bahamas or Barbados, Belize, etc. So in terms of the agenda for increasing productivity, we can think of 3 factors that influence labor productivity growth: skills, innovation, and business climate. The engine that generates good jobs is healthy growth of work productivity. And this can be the main determinants, that including having a trained workforce, a mass of companies that are innovating, and an adequate invest in business climate. And to end the presentation, I wanted to make the third and last point about the importance of, within the equation of increasing labor productivity, increasing total productivity in Jamaica, the importance of the reskilling and upskilling agenda. We know that overall we can impact labor productivity through reskilling and upskilling. And we also know that with COVID-19, we are facing a new set of demands for the labor market. We are seeing a movement in terms of the trade and movements in terms of investment, and countries are requiring different skills, and we have to be able to identify the skills that are necessary today, prepare the training system to provide those skills to the workers so companies are able to have the talent they need. And then monitor the situation in terms of how the training system is equipped with the training that is necessary for the labor force to continue being a flexible training system that can change according to the new demands. So this is the last point of the agenda for today in terms of the presentation, but I would love to continue the conversation with Gavin and Jackie. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Gavin, can we hear a little bit from you, maybe?
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you for that setup, Laura. That really, I was saying thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Laura, for that setup. I think it really puts into perspective the comments which I have concerning labor law reform in Jamaica specifically, and looking at some of the challenges that we have had here in Jamaica and how we can overcome them. So, in terms of the Roadmap to Jamaica 2.0, we want Jamaica to be the place to live, to raise our families, and to do business in the future. Labor law reform is an important aspect of that. So I just want to zoom in on a couple of important issues that Laura had set up. One are the labor costs, but really the hidden labor costs in Jamaica. And in particular, we're talking about the severance costs. Now, Laura spoke about the de jure labor costs. I'm going to be looking somewhat at the de facto costs of salaried labor. And the severance costs that you don't see on the books is a big part of that. And I'm also going to be looking at some of the regulatory rigidities that Laura had highlighted as being one of the hurdles or obstacles for growth, and the reason why we need to have labor law reform in order to really reach that productivity target and to pass the Trinidadians. I don't know how Trinidad is at 46%. I mean, literally, they have a public holiday every 2 weeks, but there they are. They're ahead of us. So we need to pass them, folks. We're looking at growth areas, and I've highlighted a couple of areas which are essentially the golden geese for our employment sector. The first, of course, are BPOs. Now, at the start of 2020, it was estimated about 40,000 employees were in the BPO sector, and that's up from 26,000 in 2018 and 17,000 in 2014. So I don't have those fancy graphs like Laura has, but I think it would look something like this. So it's really a very high growth area that we're looking at. They have the highest employment growth rate of any sector in the last decade, and they've contributed 4% of GDP in 2018. Also want to look at tourism, of course. It directly employs 9% of our workforce, and indirectly, I think estimates can go as high as 30%. In 2019, the contribution of travel and tourism to GDP was 34.7%, up from 28.4% 10 years prior. And it is, I think, as we have all unfortunately seen, the industry that is most vulnerable to the COVID-19 pandemic, natural disasters, and climate change. So, what's kind of holding us back? We have a labor relations code that has not been updated in 44 years. It's older than me, folks. And in spite of the efforts that employers and even some trade unions and employee organizations have tried to make to see that this document can be updated, we don't seem to be making any progress with it. Now, in the late 70s, our work environment was very different from it is now. And it's very different than it is going to be in the next 5 years, especially with how we're doing work now. Having a 44-year-old document still guiding us in our employment relations is just useless, I'm sorry to say. We need to have something done about that, and urgently. There's an uncertainty of severance costs. Now, in some Latin American countries, they have essentially a sum of money or a formula that you can use to be able to terminate someone's employment and pay them what they call an indemnity. So once I pay this amount of money, and that money is determined to be enough that would allow the employee to survive and transition into another job. Once I pay them that sum of money, then I don't have to then go and establish any kind of fault or any kind of reason. I can just assist them to move into their next job. In Jamaica, you could find yourself terminating somebody and paying millions of dollars, or equating to sometimes 2 or 3 years worth of salary to an employee because of that termination. And very often, the feeling in the employment sector is that these payments are punitive as opposed to trying to compensate an employee and get them back on their feet. I'll give you an example. Recently, there was an award from our tribunal where an employee who had been dismissed had found a job, literally 2 months, a better paying permanent job, literally 2 months after they had been terminated. And they still awarded that employee 1 year of salary, 1 year of salary. And you kind of get the feeling that, you know, that's not sending the right message to employers and not encouraging people to bring more people into the workforce, if that's some of the costs that we might have to bear when the relationship is coming to an end. We have a broken dispute resolution system, a system where our government agencies are really too heavily involved in overseeing this system. And it's especially because these agencies are the same ones which are mandated to keep people employed. So there's kind of an implicit conflict of interest where the body that's supposed to ensure that unemployment rates stay low and continue to trend low are the same ones that are trying to help you resolve a dispute over whether the person should still remain in your employ. And of course, no government wants to be seen as anti-worker, all right? We're talking about, you know, politics here. And the fact is that we know that the trade union movement is very powerful in Jamaica and connected to both political parties. And we certainly aren't advocating for there to be a return to the bad old days when employees had no rights. But we do say that there is a better way and there is a balance which could be struck, which will start to encourage and incentivize employment in the formal sector and also employment from foreign investors. So, Laura, you might not know about this, but we had a big scandal which we call the Petro Jam. And after it really involved a government agency which ended up secretly under a non-disclosure agreement or a very private agreement, paying out to a public servant, I think it was $9 million or so, to avoid them going to the Industrial Disputes Tribunal. This is a state-run tribunal that the state is paying millions of dollars to not have to go before. And that just kind of highlights the problem that the private sector also has, because we don't have the resources of the government to be able to pay our way out of this body. But the government, which is mandated to ensure that this tribunal itself is fair, is using taxpayer money to not go there. Now, what has happened is that we thought after that scandal broke that there was going to be some renewed focus and energy put into labor law reform. There were some meetings and discussions which were held immediately in the wake of it. And thus far, nothing has happened. It has really all come to a grinding halt. And yet still the government has continued to quietly pay massive sums to avoid going before the tribunal. I mean, estimates are varied, but I would think that at least $100 million a year, if not 2 or 3 times that, is being paid out by the various government agencies to make sure that they don't have to abide by the rigidity of the system that they are a part of. So, what have been the reactions in the BPO and the tourism sectors? Because one thing that we know is that when you have these inflexible regulations, which are not friendly to investment, one of two things is going to happen. You're either not going to have these businesses invest in Jamaica and hire people in the formal sector, or they're going to hire them and they're going to find ways around the system. So some of the ways which industry has found a way out of the system includes, for instance, there are no unions in BPOs within the special economic zones. So in order to attract these investment in this high growth employment area, the government had to essentially say that we're going to shield you from the trade unions. And that says a lot. There's a lot that we can learn about the industrial relations landscape, where we need to essentially be telling employers, especially the foreign investors, that we're going to shield you from the trade unions as an incentive for you to come here. They do make them sign a document saying that we're going to abide by all local labor laws, which they would have to do in any event. But still, it really does send a message that we're essentially recognizing that there is a relationship between growth in employment and some of our systems and practices over the last several decades. Another way is fixed term contracts. A lot of employers are using fixed term contracts for 6 months, 1 year, or 2 years. And what that means is that they don't have to be hit with these enormous costs of exit. They simply will say, I'm going to wait until your contract is up and I'm not going to renew it, all right? Or if you take me to the tribunal, the tribunal is only going to pay the balance of your contract, which might only be 1 month by the time that we get there. So it's a way of bringing that certainty that the law doesn't provide. I know what my maximum exposure is. I know what my labor costs are going to be. And therefore, that's the only basis on which I'm doing it. Now, what does that result in? On the next slide, we're going to look at the unintended effects of pushing employers into fixed-term contract relationships. They also have a thing called contract breaks, Laura. Contract break in Jamaica, and I think in other countries as well, is where you essentially send the employee home for 2 weeks or more and then bring them back, which then resets the clock, and they come in as new employees. And the Ministry of Labor really doesn't like that, but at the end of the day, they understand, I think, why so many employers feel the need to do that. It's a way of avoiding regulations which they think are not in line with the way to do business in 2020. There's also this practice of blacklisting of troublemakers. So if you get fired in one BPO, good luck finding another job in the BPO sector, right? And there are laws in some countries which prevent things like that. We don't have that here. And so when we're speaking about labor law reform, we're not just speaking about reforming the laws for the benefit of employers. No. We are saying as well that when you do a reform, you have the opportunity to fix some of these errors which are having unintended and really adverse consequences for the majority of employees in your golden goose sectors. So some of these unintended outcomes and bad outcomes. As we said, it's less attractive to foreign investment because on the face of it, when people are being told that this is the cost of doing business in Jamaica, they sometimes will come here, but do they stay here? Do they tell their other other players in the industry that Jamaica is the place to do business once they come here and they see the de facto cost of salaried labor? Less payroll taxes to the government is also a big issue because, of course, as people are pushed out of the formal employment sector and into the informal sector, the gig economy, you're finding that there's less compliance with income tax filing. You know, in Jamaica, you have to file you don't file your own returns if you are on PAYE. And that's something they're going to be looking at. So once you're pushed into the informal sector, the tax revenues tend to dry up. There's less job security. As we've seen, if you have a 6-month contract and there's no law in Jamaica which stops you from having a dozen successive 6-month contracts. And so what that means is that, of course, you don't know when your contract is not going to be renewed and when you're going to be suddenly unemployed. Lower wages as well is part of the outcome, because if you don't have the kind of job security, you don't really have a strong bargaining position to say that you should be paid more. And a big issue, especially for my wife, who is head of the Pension Industry Association, is that there are more employees without pensions. I think there are only 11% of our workforce is pension now, and part of that is because so many are on fixed-term contracts and independent contractor relationships. Now, I know that there's an effort, especially in the tourism sector, to fix that. The BPO sector is not, I think, on the list of industries that's going to have similar treatment. And finally, more employees without benefits like paid leave. Now, if you're on a 6-month or a 1-year fixed-term contract, things like vacation leave and maternity leave are not ever going to apply to you, because you must be employed for at least 1 year to be able to benefit from maternity leave. And our law says that you're not entitled to take vacation leave in the first year of your employment. So if every year of your employment is the first year of your employment, then we know that you're actually never going to be taking a vacation. So again, because employers are trying to beat the system, it ends up having an adverse effect on workers. And that, I think, is the biggest incentive to the government to listen to the employers, to listen to the private sector, and see how they can resolve these issues, because everybody loses when we have an outdated statutory regime. So I think there's a better way. I do think that they need to listen and react to employers' concerns. I do think that they have been at least hearing us, but I don't think they're listening to us. And I know for a fact they're not doing much about it. We need to balance and expand the labor relations code. So again, this document, which is 40-odd years old, doesn't actually give you a lot of guidance on how to do things like even have a redundancy exercise. So there was an example a few years ago of a company which had to cut costs and decided to do a redundancy exercise, and they tried to have the meetings and the consultation with the employees. There is no guide anywhere onto how long the consultation should take, what form it should take. But what ended up happening was that our tribunal said that they didn't do a good job of consulting and awarded them 1 year salary. Now, 1 year salary, to put that in context, you would have to have worked for 20 years in that business for you to have 1 year salary as a redundancy payment. So you had employees who got 1 year salary as compensation when their redundancy payment was probably only 6 or 8 weeks. That's what we talk about when we say the hidden costs of doing business. So it's not as if you could even say that you broke this rule or that rule, because there are no written rules, but yet still the judgment which came down on that company could very well have put them into bankruptcy and caused everybody else in that business to lose their jobs. So we need to establish an independent industrial dispute resolution body comprised of trained professionals, independent of the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, and persons who have the freedom to act as they wish to act without being employees of the ministry. And of course, training and being alive to the issues that both sides have. There needs to be a maximum limit on monetary awards to give you that certainty that I can hire somebody and I can build into my model the cost of the entire relationship, including if it goes bad. And we need to give employers equal access to the tribunal for their complaints. If you have a complaint against your employee, how they have treated you, how they have left your business, you do not currently have access to our tribunal, which it says on paper is there for both employers and employees. And finally, after we've done all of that, after we've listened, after we've reacted, after we've brought everybody to the table, that's when you step in and amend the laws to close those loopholes which I spoke about, and you penalize the truly abusive employers, the ones who are really coming in here to take advantage of Jamaican citizens and take an unfair advantage of the disparities and the lack of protections which they have. We need to close those loops and make sure that we don't treat all employers as one big bad group of victimizers, and reward those who are good employers and make sure we're focusing our penalties on the really bad ones. And that's my presentation, folks. Thank you for your time and attention, and I really look forward to a robust discussion in the Q&A section.
That was very awesome, Gavin, thank you. What I would like to throw out to all the members and panel is that, what is our takeaway? We know that we want productivity. We want to encourage investment, which will help with our employment rates. But at the same time, we want a fair balance between employer and employee. Not only do we want to fix our labor codes, but we want to talk about expanding them, because we need to understand how to work from home, how does teleworking work, so we have a lot on the table. So coming out of today, it would be a win if as a team, we could all think of ways to expand how things are currently, because I heard Gavin said that it's been 44 years. So guys, we have to balance complicating the issue or seeing if we could find a way to simplify with what we have already. So some thought that came to my mind today is, could we revise what we have and suggest some addendums and go to the government, all with the hope of expanding the way we work because of the pandemic, of course. It can't be business as usual. There is a thought process that when we Jamaicans go abroad, we are the best workers ever. And sometimes the working conditions abroad are harsher than ours. So is there a nugget in there? What are we missing? Is it that discipline is required to get productivity? Do we need to find that balance? Because I would suggest to you that right now, we're definitely lacking discipline. We are allowing the low common denominator to rise to the top based on the payouts that you said. I've heard over and over that the IDT is more concerned with form over substance. So it's not a matter of whether you've done something wrong. It's a matter, did you have that redundancy exercise done correctly? And of course, there's no playbook that we can run our finger down and tick a box. So having said that, I don't want to steal the floor. It's not all about me. So I want to say to our members that, perhaps we could open it to you, and in an orderly manner, let's get some questions answered, or if you just like to give us some feedback. If you want Laura or Gavin to answer something specifically, let us know that that question is for them. And, if you would just like to share something that you think can help us guide us, because what I'm hoping that we'll do coming out of this would be to present, something to the government. Gavin perhaps will hold my hand and lead me on that. I don't want the PSOJ to get into a battle with the unions or the government, but I'm kind of thinking outside the box that maybe the PSOJ needs to have a standard, almost as if we're applying for tax compliance certificate. And if employers do a certain number of things, they can be trusted to handle their hiring and firing without the need to have a tribunal over their head. And we know that not every employer can be perfect. But what I would suggest to the government is, let's not broad brush all employers as bad. And the members of the PSOJ could be a start, because maybe we could have mechanism where we go into our member companies and fill out a scorecard for them and figure out if we believe that they're A, B, or C. So having given you that mouthful, I'd like to say, could we open the floor to see if we have members who would like to either give us some feedback or ask some questions? Jolene, would that be okay?
I would like to just mention something, Jackie, if it's okay with you.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yes, I was very interested in Gavin's presentation and your reflections, Jackie, about how to move forward, right? And when Gavin was mentioning the outcomes that he sees from where we are today, they were really like negative outcomes, no? The less attractive to foreign investment, the less payroll taxes, less job security, right? So maybe for the discussion that you're proposing in the future, how we can set up the results that we want to see for Jamaica in the future, right? But really like prioritizing what are the main results that we want to see. Is it competitiveness? Is it workers' coverage against risks? Better pensions? Is it job creation? Worker security? And I think the pandemic in many countries is opening this space of discussion between the public and the private sector and the workers to see what is the new social contract, right? So I think it's important to set up the results that we want to see in the future, and as I mentioned, prioritizing them. Sometimes for a country, one of the results is more important than the others, or is prevalent because of the need for a specific time, right? So we can set up, all together, as you mentioned, the members of the PSOJ, but also the government and others could sit and see what are the needs, the priority needs. And in terms of the changes in the labor relations code, it's one thing to change the papers and another thing to change the processes and digitalization and all of the things that can help us, like putting at work the paperwork, right? It's important. So maybe also like planning to do not only the changes that are in the labor laws, but also all the implementation structure processes. And as you mentioned, maybe simplifying some of them because they can be like a lot, right? In many countries. So I just wanted to have these two reflections.
Yeah. Laura, thank you for that reflection, because it wasn't lost on me, or productivity, how bad it is, and the employers are worried about productivity. So we're missing something. Our labor laws aren't working for us.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand that you're saying the whole entire overhaul, and let's kind of think what our priorities are, so we understand what's the result that we want before we jump in. So I take that on board fully, and I think that will be a good guide. So thank you for that. I noticed we do have a question that came in. While we've heard a fairly large number of these stories regarding severance payments, has there been quantitative analysis done? Gavin, can you direct me if we do have that quantitative analysis?
Well, my firm tracks some of these awards which come out and does not a quantitative analysis or a deep dive, but just an overview of the direction in which some of these awards have been going. And definitely the trend is towards, in redundancy claims, the trend is towards greater payouts. And in actually unjustifiable dismissal claims, in fact, we're seeing some of those awards coming down. So there is a lot of data there which can be parsed and guide the discussion on on where we are. Again, one of the challenges is that, when we have in the court system, when we're talking about the appropriate sanction for murder, rape, and robbery, we have something called a sentencing guideline, and it essentially tells you, okay, if you've done this, then we're starting off at this number of years of a sentence, and it can go up and down depending on various factors. And one thing that we don't have right now is any kind of reliable guidance on what you might end up paying if you make a mistake, because the way that the payment is, the sentence, so to speak, has been determined is not always made very clear in the judgments which come down.
So what I hear you saying is that we need to ask for transparency for all. Yeah. I noticed Dr. Colette J.A. Smith. Can you please go with your question? Good, and good morning to you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes. Absolutely.
All right, excellent presentation by Laura and Gavin. I have a question for Laura. When I was doing my research for my PhD in governance and public debt management, I found that the public sector wage bill was a significant part of the overall labor to GDP rate. To what extent is the public sector contributing to that high rate of labor to GDP that you mentioned in your presentation, Laura? And if so, based on the information you have from the government of Jamaica so far, how are we doing in terms of reducing that? And then I have a question and a question about COVID-19 and globalization of labor.
Right. Thank you very much for the question. Actually, this calculation of the indicator that I shown is composed by the minimum wage as established by law, plus all the non-wage costs that I mentioned, including the pensions and social security contributions and the paid leave, etc., as a percentage of GDP per worker. But it's not this differentiating between the public and the private sector. It's not like the portion of the total GDP of the country. That's something that you are like leading to with your question. It's mostly how the legal framework in terms of minimum wage and non-wage costs is compared to the GDP per worker. But in reflection about your question in terms of the importance of differentiating between the public and the private sector when analyzing this is key. But in many countries, this distinction is not really done. So this is something that for a research for the future could be analyzed. But for the indicator per se, it's not differentiating the public and the private sector sides.
Thank you very much, Laura. Two other quick questions. Excellent presentation, Gavin. Very balanced in terms of the employer-employee relationships and the rights of the worker and the employer. Now, in terms of the legislation, where are we in terms of the amendments that are required as we come out of this session today? What sort of takeaway can we have as a team from the PSOJ and also with other persons who are participating in this in terms of amendments that are to be made? Because we really are very, very inefficient. Productivity is extremely low, but at the same time, wage rates are also low, and we're wondering whether or not there is a connection between wage rates and performance.
Yeah, where are we in terms of legislation? That's an excellent question. I don't know where we are. I know that I think the PSOJ as well as Jamaica Employers Federation, Jamaican Bar Association have all made representations to the Ministry of Labor about changes which need to be made. I think the Bar Association even sent a draft of an updated labor relations code. And I think that probably is on about file 13 at the Ministry of Labor right now. So I don't really think that they are, it's on the front burner, let me say. I do know that they were saying that they're going to have some all-encompassing legislation, a huge overhaul of the existing legislation. And sometimes that's kind of an excuse, a cop-out. Same thing they were saying about the bankruptcy laws, same thing about the Companies Act. Same thing about occupational health and safety. You know, when you try to go so big and say, listen, we need to have this huge overhaul because it's been 44 years, it ends up taking another 44 until you get it done. It's much better if you actually take it step by step, chip away at it, get even one document amended, one law amended this year. And you'll find that even the incremental value of doing that makes your ultimate task of overhaul so much easier and actually makes it done in a shorter space of time.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And a final question for the panel. Based on what is happening with the COVID-19 pandemic, digitalization of businesses, education, etc., we are going to have greater access to labor globally. What are the implications for us in terms of wage rates and labor laws? I know there's nobody from the ILO here this morning, but it's something to talk about. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why I said BPOs is such a big sector, because I know they were declared to be essential service when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. You know, they're exempt from the curfew and everything. So I think our positioning in terms of advancing that sector has been very beneficial to us. And I think it could mean that more and more people will be looking to Jamaica to provide that kind of service in this digital economy.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So we have three questions coming in. So Kay Thomas would like to know, how do we treat with those very short term contracts of 1 month, 3 months, 6 months without any certainty of renewal? So
what do we treat with that?
Right.
I think, as I said, I think that's a symptom of a deeper problem. I don't think you're going to be able to fix the symptom itself without fixing the underlying problem, which is that employers are trying to get around laws which are outdated and oppressive to business.
So I think the important point that Kay Thomas is making is that this is happening in the public sector also. So let's just put that under our hat, Gavin, when we're trying to get this going, that if even the government's trying to beat the system, we have a system that needs fixing. I think we can all agree on that.
That's true. I mean, the government has a lot of fixed term contracts, and they give you a gratuity in lieu of pension, which is then tied to your performance, so they can take it away from you if you. It's really not they're not setting a very good example, I should say.
Awesome. So
Wow.
Colin Virgo has given me a little bit of a challenge, and we accept. I'm accepting on behalf of Gavin without him saying so. So Colin is saying, listen, good morning. There's a few inaccuracies in what you've been saying. Perhaps we, the PSOJ, should get together with the Employers Federation and have a frank conversation directly with them and the unions. So if Gavin is up for it to hold my hand, I'm in.
Yeah, I mean, Colin also speaks about the Labor Market Law Reform, Labor Market Reform Commission, which is an extensive work. I mean, I take your word for it. I haven't seen the report. I've been asking for it. And at the end of the day, a report, you know, as Laura said, having something on paper isn't very helpful to us if we're not actually doing anything to implement it. The last major piece of legislation in the employment sphere was the flexi-time laws in 2014. You know, we've been in a pandemic for over a year now, or just about a year now, and there hasn't been one law passed to deal with the specific employment issues coming out of this pandemic. So as much as a lot of, you know, work has been done in boardrooms, nothing has come out of it.
Not transcending.
All
right. So what I'll say to Colin then is, you know, if it's possible, maybe he can share with us that report after this meeting, and then maybe we can make some kind of commitment to engage deeper. So Dan Edwards is also wanting to ask us productivity. We need to improve on our approach to new ways of working. So we have new tools out there, and she's quite right. And I think that goes, so I guess that's what you're struggling with, Gavin. Even though we've been living in a scenario where we're under curfew, under restrictions, our government hasn't seen it necessary or critical that we have to match our working habits with that. So I agree. Thank you for that. Diane, coming out of this.
Yes, and in terms of productivity, exactly how it was mentioned, right, in the comment, what are the ways in which firms are going to rethink themselves, what type of technology tools they are going to include, on one side to allow people to work remotely, to have more flexibility in the way they work, but also to improve just processes within firms, right? To and increase overall productivity, not only labor productivity. And on that, as I mentioned, and you mentioned at the beginning, and one goal of this seminar today was also end up understanding how we can improve the happiness and productivity of all of our workers, right? And a big part of the equation is, on one side, having a career perspective, right? Knowing where we can go professionally and how we can align different skills and complement our skills with technology, right? To be able to transcend in this labor market that is so liquid, so flexible, and we're gonna need to change jobs, positions, occupations, but having the skills that are necessary to move and be productive are essential. So technology, skills, overall productivity, we need to support the firms to make all those changes. It's really important.
Awesome. So for those who came on late, what we were saying earlier, remember our employees spend most of their working day at work. So it should be a happy place. And what we have found consistently over the last few years, the relationship is tense because no one wants to make a mistake. Because we don't feel that the IDT is there in a balanced way for us all. Everybody's on tenterhooks. So employment letters are very, harsh and detailed. You don't want to speak with the employee without a witness. We have lost something along the way. We've lost that sense of community, sense of family. And I hope we can all take it on board that culture is important. We need to be fostering good relationships. And so that needs to be looked at as we seek to address these issues that we're having. So Michael Acknoff just is saying to us that we don't have a HR practitioner here in this community, and they really would bring us valuable input. So, I'll speak to Jeff Hall about that after.
So Mark Jarrett has his hand up.
Oh, all right. So there was one other person. Somebody just wants to let us know 89% of the cases that end up at the IDT are from non-unionized employees. And it's interesting to hear that because employers want to be good. Of that, I'm very sure. Yes, they'll be the outlier. So I hope that we can create a framework that employers and employees can find mutual love. And Mark, I'd like to put the floor to you.
This forum, because it's something that I've struggled with for nearly 40 years, and it has been a real hamper to productivity, mechanization, and other kind of industrial myths. A couple of things. The amendments to the labor law, it's a problem that we have as a country because we can't even amend the fines and other issues. Another issue is that to get this kind of thing passed requires both sides of parliament agreeing. And historically, we have never made decisions in the best interests of the country, and opposition has traditionally always resisted any improvements because the political gain to them is more important than the gain to the nation and the growth. and they don't realize that one day, you know, they're going to be the governing power. I think there has to be a way found to bring both sides of the political spectrum together to agree to these issues. And I think the revenue side that Gavin brought up is very important. Is, you know, money will always gain their attention, and if we can show ways to increase their coffers, then hopefully that will work. But I think it's going to require an engagement of both sides of the political aisle, so that we get full buy-in, and this subject is not like all others, used as a political football in order to gain popularity and win the next election. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Mark. I just want to say that, you know, or labor laws have been exceptional in the sense that they have had large bipartisan support. The amendments in 2014, that's the flexi time, and the amendment in 2010 passed by both sides of the House enthusiastically. And again, the trade union movement is very united. And they actually have found a lot of common ground despite politics. So some say that the lack of unity is actually on the part of the private sector. They say that we are not coming together enough and making our points get across sufficiently to the people who are the decision makers. I'm not going to say yes or no to that, but I do think that we definitely have a role and responsibility, and I'm glad the PSOJ is at the forefront of that discussion to make sure that we do our part in having these discussions and pushing the envelope.
Yes, Gavin, you're hired.
Ah! Thank you.
Awesome. Do we have any more questions? I'm not seeing any hands, so I'm not sure. Are any hands up at the moment on the screen?
Can I make a point, Jackie? Quick point.
Absolutely.
I find that a significant part of our labor productivity problem is in terms of us not having efficiency metrics within the organizations, one. Two, the quality of leadership in terms of keeping people accountable for performance and really being able to measure performance and using KPIs. We're really a lot of sort of seat of the pants, back of the envelope sort of approach. And if we get out of that and get people to understand what productivity really means to their personal lives and the economy, their families, and if we give them the incentives, I believe we can increase productivity significantly. Another positive point as we get close to wrapping up, Jamaica from the 1970s under Michael Manley has really enacted some progressive labor laws. So we have a lot to be proud of. I taught industrial relations in the Turks and Caicos Islands, and I had to teach IR for the Caribbean. And Jamaica has really set a precedence in terms of labor laws. So this conference, this conversation we're having this morning is a pivotal point for us to move forward. Let us be the Caribbean, and even in terms of ILO membership. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks for that. I think you make a good point. We don't want to backtrack on any of the good things that we have done. And Jamaica always wants to be the best at everything, including this work. So maybe we could, you know, Dr. Smith, maybe we could just use your point and say, let's try and build something through the PSOJ to go to the government that won't seek to trample on people's rights, but it would actually seek to foster better mutual respect, make people feel safer, bring back a little love, sorry to use that word, a little more love to the workplace. I find employer-employee relationships too tense now because everyone wants to stick to the letter of the law and they're not actually sure what the letter of the law is. I personally had asked some members at the Ministry of Labour to give me a handbook, write down exactly how to handle a hearing, because I am willing to obey and I'm willing to be a good student. and I was told that I'd never get it in writing. And that is something that has really made me sad, because where is the harm in documenting? So you mentioned the word accountability, Dr. Smith, and making sure that we keep the performance management and so on. Why would we not want to just lay it out for both the employer and the employee? Why the state secret? Why do we have every hearing be different? Every lawyer's interpretation be different? Every award be different? That can't, to me, as a humble person, we're only employ 600 people, so we're not, big people on the blocks. Why do you want to have unknowns in running your business? Why do we want to use productive time trying to not have a wrongful dismissal claim? I would much rather use that time building programs for employees and their families. I think as a company, we're spending way too much time trying to understand the law. Because that's all it is, understanding it. It's not clear. And I don't know if I'm off the mark or if anybody else can back that up.
No, I absolutely agree with you. We've had this discussion before. It's not that difficult, Getting a rule book that everybody can play by is part of what was the reason for the labor relations code in the first place. So let's just update it. But there's a question in there, an interesting question from Monique Todd in the chat. I wanted to know Laura's input on it. She's really asking in relation to the pandemic. Do you think that corporations are more likely to go with work from home as opposed to in the office, and what effect that you think that might have on productivity and the productivity charts which you had shown earlier?
Yes, for sure. This is something that is going to happen in the future. We're seeing with employer surveys around the world that more and more firms, now that they know that they can have proactive workers working from home, would like to move from a presential, like face-to-face environment to at least hybrid environment, like part of the week working from home, part of the week working at the firm. There are obviously also costs that are saved by the firms, having also employees working from home. In terms of space of the offices, they have to rethink the whole operation of the company in that sense. But something that Dr. Smith appealed to in terms of how also firms have to change in terms of the system, the HR systems to measure, monitor, track productivity, help employees work in the firm and remotely, have to be there, right? And this is something that firms in Latin America and the Caribbean have been struggling with. They didn't have the managerial tools to be able to have a hybrid system or a remote system in the case of the pandemic that was necessary to go remote if possible, right? So it has to be not only with the technology, cloud, having the information in the cloud, having all of the technology in place, but also the human resources, managerial tools to be able to work with people working from home. So I think it's important to work on all aspects. In that sense, many laws, as you know, in the region were approved during the pandemic, telework laws. Some of them would, yeah, they're from 12 countries that have this type of laws. 5 of them approved them during the pandemic around June and August of last year. And this discussion was good to have, but some of the laws were not really good in the overall sense that benefited the productivity of the workers, and also the job creation aspect of the laws that they need to have, right? comprehension of the needs of the employers. So I think when you move to an environment like the COVID-19, you have to sit down and reflect on what are the needs of all parties and have a law that is good for job creation and for security and productivity of the employees. So we can discuss more about this, but I love this topic. But I think in the future, the hybrid type of work is going to be there, like expanded, at least in the firms that can do that type of work, especially in services, right?
Laura, is there any sort of best practices for, a law handbook on employment practices? Is there anything for a region that we could rely on? Is that something that we could look for, since we're stabbing in the dark and we haven't been able to get off the ground with having a transparent rule book? Maybe this is the direction we should go in, marrying your point of understanding what the end game is to get that productivity and investment to grow the economy.
Yes, for sure. There is no country that is perfect in terms of all the regulations and the labor laws and the implementation of, as I say, that is very important, the implementation of the labor laws. There is no country that is perfect, but there are good practices and case studies that we at the Inter-American Development Bank have been looking at to see how, we can look at countries, how they did one aspect of the regulation well, and what can we learn from that experience, right? So, and we have that available if you would like to we can share and we can share these interesting case studies.
Yeah. I think we'd love that, because to be honest with you, success for us is that it would be positive, that everyone, all stakeholders would view it as positive. This is trying to fix our labor issues is not meant to be, an adversarial process. I noticed Diane's comments and I thank her. We do need to be collaborative and work together and have flexibility. We're not at war.
Yes.
I have always said to employees that an employer doesn't wake up in the morning saying, "Oh, goody, who can I go to work today?" Having those harsh conversations are not nice. It's painful. And if we could all understand that at the end of the day, we're all humans. We actually all have a common goal. We all have families. We all have to coexist.
Yes.
And so if coming out of this, we can try to make employment a positive experience, that would be a win-win for me.
Yes, I agree. That's why at the beginning I mentioned the importance of setting up the results that we would like to have together, right? So is it happiness, job creation, productivity, and you can name it, and we can agree on the results. Exactly. And move there with the things that we can change. And it doesn't have to be one all at the same time. It can be a process where you are adding different aspects over time.
Exactly. And happiness does equal productivity. Have you ever seen a happy person not working?
No. Yeah, that's perfect. Yes, it does.
So, all right. So I know it's time to wrap it up. Do we have any last burning questions from our audience? Gavin, they're letting you off the hook. Laura, they're letting you off the hook. So awesome. I want to say a really big thank you for this engaging, dialogue. And I'm hoping that we can do this again. Don't forget that PSOJ is having their Roadmap to Jamaica 2.0 as a series. There'll be different topics. So guys, let's now keep your calendars free to join. I want to also thank JMMB again and the IDB because they were our sponsors. So without their support, we couldn't have this. You can rewatch this in future episodes on PSOJ's YouTube channel, and also follow PSOJ on LinkedIn for additional information. From my side, I'd like to say a big thank you to Mr. Jeff Hall for putting me on the spot. I hope I didn't let him down. I've had fun today. I'm very passionate about, labor reform and employment practices. And I'm so sorry for Gavin, because I don't think that him and Laura are going to be able to get rid of me now. Will the slides of the presentation be made available to all the participants?
Yes, on my side.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, that's a yes. So I don't know if someone from the PSOJ team would like to just close us out.
Thanks everyone for coming out for our conversation today. Thank you so much, Jackie, for being our moderator, ably handling the conversation. Laura, we're really appreciating you joining us all the way from Argentina this morning. And thank you so much, Gavin, for your time. Everyone who joined us, we thank you. And as Jackie said before, this video, as well as other conversations past and future, will be available on our YouTube channel, the Private Sector Organization of Jamaica. And you can follow us on social media at the PSOJ for information on all the future conversations that are to come. So thank you so much for joining. Keep safe, and we look forward to seeing you at our next conversation.